First of all, I want to say, Ken, that I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm here because I'm really supportive of the kind of work that you're trying to do.
Thank you.
And I'm Dennis Dworkin. I'm a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno in the history department. And my specialty is European history, British history, Irish history, and I consider myself a cultural and intellectual historian, but in particular because of the fact that I've spent many, many years studying the history of Ireland, in which nationalism plays a very, very important role. I have tried to study other national cases and also to think about nationalism more generally.
And this is why we're here today. I'm talking with Dr. Dworkin because he is an expert on nationalism. So what got you into nationalism? Why did your course of modern European history take you to studying nationalism?
Sometime in the 1990s, in my field, which is British history, people became very, very interested in the British Empire, which has always been part of the study of Britain, but for reasons having to do with globalization, has become more important recently. And many of my colleagues have studied the Middle East because the British Empire was important there. They've discussed South Asia, particularly India. But I decided to study Ireland because Ireland is Britain's oldest colony, going back to the 1100s.
Oh, shoot, I didn't know that. That's crazy.
As a result of that, I became interested in what has really been absolutely essential to understanding Ireland, and that is nationalism.
Okay. So how would you define nationalism as a historian? What is nationalism?
So I think that the first thing I want to say is that nationalism is really difficult to define, and for historians, even though there's things that go across nation states in terms of their nationalism, each case is really different. But I think in general, how I would define nationalism, it's when a group of people, however defined, usually larger than a city-state and smaller than an empire, some kind of geographical space in between, believe that they have the right, they have the self-determination to decide their own political arrangements. Very often that's independence, which is what most people associate with nationalism, but it also can be autonomy within larger states. So for instance, Scotland, where nationalism is very strong, has its own parliament, but it's also part of the United Kingdom.
Why is it not bigger than an empire? Why is it not as big as an empire, and why is it that kind of middle ground range?
Well, my answer to that is that what we think of as national identity is older than the modern era. So, for instance, again, I'm going to go back to Ireland because I know it really well. So in the Middle Ages, when England invaded Ireland, people in Ireland knew that they were different than the English. But when the English weren't there, local differences were much more important than the fact that people all lived in Ireland.
Yeah.
But somewhere in the 18th to the end of the 19th century, as economies were transformed and nation states started to develop because they were more germane to modern economies, which needed unified languages and larger markets and so forth, nationalism and national identity becomes more central. It's by no means the only identity. People have racial identities, religious identities, they have various forms of cultural identities. But I believe that overall, national identity is at the top, or near the top, of people's identities in the modern era, especially in the last 200 years.
And so it functions for group success, for expanding, I guess, people who might somewhat be divided in smaller contexts, but it's able to bring a larger amount of people together under a certain identity, or?
Well, one form it can exist in is in the case of, say, England and its imperial expansion, that is the empire and its industrialization. It can be a form of identity that defines these projects. But in other cases, in the case of Ireland, which is the object of English expansion, nationalism becomes a form of opposition and the attempt at self-determination.
So it's almost resisting an occupation or resisting an invasion. Recently, within the last 200 years, now we're seeing that resistance form into a national movement. What would it be before the last 200 years, before nationalism? I guess what was the case?
So, I mean, this is really an interesting question, because I think that national elements are involved. But let's take the case of Italy, which is also a really interesting case, because Italy's been around a long time, and the notion of being Italian, loosely constructed, has also been around a long time. But Italy didn't exist as an actual state or a nation state until 1870. And before that, Italy was subject to all kinds of foreign rule and internal rules. And it was mostly comprised of city-states, Venice and Florence probably being the most popular. But in the 19th century, in the wake of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, where the idea of political self-determination became so important, nationalism became a focus in Italian life to create an independent Italian state free of foreign influence. But ironically, around 1870, and I can't remember who said this, but it's one of the great quotes, we've made Italy, but now we have to make Italians. And that's because in Italy, people's regional and local differences were more prominent than being Italian. And it really wasn't even until after the Second World War that Italian became the first language for most people.
And is that maybe why you can't be as big as can't be a huge empire, because that just covers too much difference among people? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for instance, in the case of the British Empire, there was an attempt to create a larger notion of Britishness, so that people in the Caribbean or people in South Asia were told that they were British, but in fact, their local identities were always much more prominent. And when they started migrating to Britain, because they felt in some way that they were part of this and that they were British, people in Britain said, oh, no, that's not what we meant at all.
Oh, okay. What did they mean? Just call yourself this? Just basically put a label in front of your desk that says, I am British? Or how?
Well, it meant a series of institutions. So it was one thing for, say, India to have parliamentary institutions which were subject to the crown, or to have the spread of English. And in fact, India was not a nation state. It was created as a nation state. India was a subcontinent with multiple languages, cultures, religion, ethnicities, castes, classes, and so forth. And it was through the national movement that we can actually talk about India as a nation state, and India, through nationalism, was created this.
So in some ways, nationalism is good. It creates some of the countries we know today.
Yeah.
So we see some good in nationalism, but then there's this dark side where if a politician endorses being nationalistic, it's like, whoa, that sounds like Hitler. So what are the good and the bad of nationalism?
Well, I think that it's important to, first of all, distinguish types of nationalism. Okay. So the first type, which I would say comes out of the philosophical movement in the 18th century known as the Enlightenment, which is apparent in both the French and the American revolutions, is a kind of political form of nationalism, which is based on self-determination and citizenship. So when somebody passes the requirements in the United States to be a citizen, and they go through a swearing-in ceremony, then they're citizens of the United States.
Yeah.
And I think that, generally speaking, this form of nationalism is has a lot to be said for it because it doesn't make any kind of cultural distinctions. It doesn't matter if your family's been here 200 years or 20 years, you're an American.
Yeah.
And then there's cultural nationalism, which is the kind of nationalism that I think we usually think of as nationalism, and it really gets people in the gut because it defines people culturally, either religiously or racially or ethnically or religiously.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to talk in this fashion all the time. And that nationalism can lead people to forms of heroic sacrifice and fighting for causes which are larger than themselves. And in Ireland, again, the case that I know the best, there's a tradition of martyrdom where people in various forms of actions will oppose the British government. And there's a whole list of Irish nationalist martyrs that have sacrificed their lives. But the downside,
like a suicide bombing or a car bombing or
earlier on, it was forms of kind of attempts to create revolutions. More recently in Northern Ireland, it could be more random forms of violence, but the belief was that these random forms of violence would rid Britain from the northern part of Ireland. Okay? The problem with cultural nationalism is that it always defines itself in relationship to another. So if you're not part of that religious group, or you're not part of those language speakers, or if you're not part of those that are part of that ethnicity, or you're not part of that race, then you can be defined outside of the nation. And I think probably the most famous case of this is the Third Reich, where it was racially impossible for Jews to become Germans. And we all know the consequences of that.
And so cultural nationalism sets up the stage for automatic us versus them conflict, where civil, it creates the us without implicitly creating a them other than everyone who's just not American, not specifically an enemy. It's we find who we're together with, we focus on that, but we're not focusing on the enemy. But cultural nationalism focuses on the enemy, or who is the other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Enemy is not necessarily always the case, but certainly the other. And I totally agree with you. And the kind of the gist of your question, which is that civic nationalism is more inclusive, because I mean my family was not here in the American Revolution, but that doesn't mean that George Washington is not in some basic way my ancestor within a civic national context. And
Still your founding father in the sense that you identify as American, therefore.
Right. As a citizen of the United States, not because my family came over in the Mayflower, which they definitely did not. And I mean, Americans in elementary school, whenever they say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, that's where we are all Americans, no matter what our background, no matter what our race, no matter what our religion, and that in many respects, that's the promise of America, as put forth in classical texts, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so forth. But at some level, that doesn't get people in the gut. And so cultural nationalism gets people in the gut in ways that civic nationalism often does not. And sometimes it's just the other. But it can be an enemy.
Okay. And so we were talking about the difference between, in Italy, different cities around the country have their own identity, and the challenge of nationalism was bringing, yes, Italy, but now the Italian identity. So what would be the difference between a nation and a state, and why they're all in the same country now, but why?
Okay. So I mean, again, that's a really good question, and it forces me to think in terms of distinctions. First of all, I want to say that these are not clad cases. There's always going to be intertwining and overlapping, but basically the nation is this cultural or political form of aspiring to some kind of political arrangement based on self-determination. And as we've outlined, there's civic nationalism and there's cultural nationalism. But in fact, in the United States, they operate together, right? And I gave I gave the example of the Pledge of Allegiance, but there's also, say, debates about teaching languages in the school. And I mean, theoretically, it shouldn't have to be English for a civic nationalist, but for a cultural nationalist, it might have to be English, depending on how they define the nation.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the state is a political organization that, in a certain sense, fulfills the life of the nation or guarantees the life of the nation.
So the nation is the people, the state is the government.
Is the loosely speaking, I think that's true. Is that that the people make up the nation, and the state represents some form of their self-determination, however they determine it. But I want to again emphasize that does not have to be an independent state. So people in Quebec are divided, say, over whether or not Quebec should be independent or part of Canada. People in Scotland so far have decided that Scottish national aspiration can be realized in the United Kingdom. But most of Ireland, for instance, has decided, all 26 counties as of 1922, that they wanted to go as a form of separation, whereas 6 counties in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, have stuck with the UK.
And we could see a lot of historical drama from just the American Civil War of when a nation, or we want people who have their own national identity wanting to have that revolution internally already from the existing nation. The nation works as its own superorganism to suppress that, I guess, infection.
Yeah, and the Civil War is really of great interest to me. Not that I'm a Civil War historian, but at least from the perspective that we're talking about today, it could be conceived as competing nationalisms.
And we would see this in Ireland. And I know you're not a Middle Eastern historian, but in just the terms of a historian outlook in Israel and Palestine, we'd say it's just 2 nationalist movements that are fighting for independence and so far have not made any want to stay together.
Yeah, and from my perspective, that's absolutely true, which is, on the one hand, you have Arab nationalism, which, and more particularly Palestinian nationalism, which is largely a 20th century phenomena and can be historically traced mostly to the period of the First World War. And then you have Zionism, which is nothing more than Jewish nationalism, which is probably traceable to the third quarter of the 19th century, which is not to say, in the case of the Jewish experience, that historically there hasn't been a religious aspiration to return to Jerusalem, and in fact, in the Passover Seder every year, that's the last line. Next year we would be in Jerusalem. But I think it's probably safe to say that people in the 17th century, when Jews said that at the Passover Seder, they didn't imagine the state of Israel. What they imagined was a religious return. And I think what happens in the late 19th and the early 20th century is a belief that religious aspiration, in part, also cultural aspirations that were not necessarily religious. Many of the original Zionists were not religious; they were in fact socialists. They wanted to have a form of self-determination and an independent state that was free of foreign rule, which was complex because Jews lived everywhere.
Yeah. And I like to bring the Israel-Palestine conflict into light because the problem is 2 national identities fighting each other. And it doesn't seem like there's any resolve. It doesn't seem like cooperation's around the corner. But in Ireland, we did have a similar situation, and there was cooperation. It did come to resolve. So what was the resolve in the Irish problem?
Okay.
And how was that? What's the story behind that?
So just very briefly, for people that are not familiar with it, in Northern Ireland, which is 6 counties with a population of about 1.5 million people, in the late 60s and early 70s erupted because Northern Ireland was more Protestant than Catholic, and Protestants used their power to basically politically oppress Catholics. And in the late 60s, Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland who wanted to be either freer economically and socially, or part of the Republic of Ireland, which had already split off, they basically create a movement that is modeled after the American Civil Rights Movement. And to make a very, very long story short, this erupts into violence, in which something like on the order of 3,000 people die between the late 60s and the middle of the 1990s, when the Irish Republican Army, the main revolutionary group among Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland, agrees to a ceasefire. There's also Protestant paramilitaries that agree to the same thing, but the Irish Republican Army is better organized and is better known. In 1998, under the auspices of the Clinton administration in the United States, and representatives from Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and the British government, a treaty is signed that really brings this period to a close, in which Protestants and Catholics acknowledge the other's right to their heritage and the other's right to a form of self-determination, even within Northern Ireland.
Yes, okay. So the key was somehow, maybe it took some third party to help them see it, or to force them to sit down, force leaders to sit down, however they did it, to finally say, you have some value, you do have some real legitimate claim, I understand you, I hear you. How did that situation come to be? What did the American government say? How did they step in?
Well, there are many things that took place. For one thing, there were American politicians, and the United States is so important to this because Irish Catholics in the United States, who in many cases were politically conservative, were funding the Irish Republican Army because Irish Catholics had a kind of historical contempt for Britain because of the role that Britain has played in Irish history. But a group of American politicians, of which Ted Kennedy was probably the best known, basically began working with Irish politicians and British politicians to get a dialogue started, because both sides realized that this was a stalemate and a generation had been wasted.
I like how you say a generation has been wasted. And it seems like I know Israel, Palestine's not your niche, but we see 3 generations. Would you say because of the violence, those are wasted generations, or in some way that helped bring them together? Or no, they were at a stalemate, it didn't help at all. Obviously, that's why third parties had to come in. It's because it's not doing anything.
Okay, so I'm an historian, and what I would say is clearly there's enough people on both sides that don't feel that.
Yeah, okay.
And that's really, really key, because in Northern Ireland, the people of the center would have wanted to end it a lot sooner, and maybe never started at all, and worked it out peacefully from the beginning. But on the right and the left of the struggle, the extreme Catholics and the extreme Protestants generated this conflict and kept it going until the mid-1990s, when they began to realize that it couldn't go on. And a number of things took place, so this became real. So in Northern Ireland, if you're Protestant, you can have citizenship in the UK, it's part of the UK. But if you're Catholic, you can have citizenship in the UK or the Republic of Ireland.
And this was the compromise?
That was, that's one of the things, is to acknowledge that Northern Ireland was not, strictly speaking, in the UK. So that's important. Legislation in Northern Ireland has to be approved by both the Catholic parties and the Protestant parties in order for it to become law, because historically Protestant parties used their majority status to oppress the minority. So a series of of dialogue took place, where people had to understand each other in cultural terms as valuing the other culture, but also political arrangements had to exist.
And so it seems like at a certain point, one side, both sides realized this violence is too much. Would you say that was the case? That someone was like, all right, too much violence. We're not actually freeing ourselves. We're not defending ourselves. So let's try to compromise.
I think that's generally true, but the real people that made the peace were the people in the center, who convinced the people on the extremes that they should be part of this dialogue. So the Ulster Unionist Party, David Trimble, and the Social Democratic Labour Party of John Hume, they both won the Nobel Prize because they were really the ones who both believed in democracy and and a peaceful resolution of this. They were able to prevail upon the extreme parties, which would be Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, to become part of a process, which, by the way, was torturous. And although the Good Friday Agreement, which is its hallmark, is now 25 years old. It took several years for this actually to be workable, and it's still very, very precarious.
My next book is going to be about if a situation is hopeless, if coming to a compromise, starting dialogue is possible, if there's ever a situation where it's just not going to happen, or the likelihood is so small that even if they see that we're getting tens of thousands of our own people killed, we're still going to do it. Compromise is completely off the table. What historical situations recently fit that description of being hopeless, but then eventually there was hope? We got the Irish situation, but what else? And if a situation seems hopeless for a while, does an approach change?
Well, I mean, those are the two cases I know the best.
Okay.
I'm reluctant to go further, but I think that UNR is really well known for its Basque Studies program. But the conflicts that go on in the Basque Country, with ETA being kind of analogous to the Irish Republican Army, and Basque nationalism being kind of analogous in the Spanish context as Irish nationalism is in the British context. I think that conceivably could be another case where actually despair became the root of thinking one's way out of it.
But besides that, are you familiar with any other examples where the situation is hopeless, but then they figure out a way to do it? Or when a situation is hopeless and it's simple, when you can't sit down to have dialogue, when you can't recognize people have some form of value, that is when it's hopeless, is when you can't do this.
I'm afraid when it gets that hopeless, it might just be pure subjection.
Okay.
So
how do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, if we take the example of the Ukraine, where there's, again, competing forms of nationalism, Russian nationalism, and a conception of the Ukraine as being part of historical Russia, and Ukrainian nationalism, which I guess really doesn't need definition for anybody. But if the Ukraine is defeated, it's almost inconceivable, in the immediate term, and maybe even a generation, that any of that will change.
Historically, how have the aggressors in nationalist conflicts, how have they came to settle down and to actually want to cooperate and not just dominate? Or in cases when someone has that conquestal behavior, are they just set on that and you have to fight?
So many of the cases in nationalism have to do with imperial opposition, that is, opposition to empires. I mean, the shorthand answer to that could be 2 world wars.
Yeah.
In which the European empires, which in the early 20th century seemed totally solid, basically began to disappear under the weight of military conflict, the stretching of resources, no longer seeming to be invulnerable, and for a whole variety of reasons.
So I'm getting a little off what we were talking about, but we are getting into the history of nationalism. It had very similar characteristics in the American and the French Revolution, and it came from the Enlightenment. So is it did nationalism start with the French Revolution, or when did nationalism start? How did it evolve?
Well, I think that as I said, in the case of both the American Revolution and the French Revolution, you have the ideas of the European Enlightenment, where self-determination of the nation becomes key as an extension of the self-determination of the individual.
Okay.
But cultural nationalism has different roots.
Okay.
And its roots are Romanticism.
And that's earlier. What time period?
It's depending on how you define it. It's roughly the same time, although Romanticism tends to become later and is more of a 19th century phenomena. But Romanticism, although it's linked to the Enlightenment, Romanticism is about the gut. It's about imagination and creativity and emotion, and it's conceptualizing the individual in different ways. And culture is absolutely central to the Romantic vision, and a culture that is distinct by language or religion or ethnicity, again, however conceived, because national cases vary from by case to case.
Okay. And so we're saying nationalism is the most important concept in the last 200 years. It came from the Enlightenment. Well, I guess why would it be the most important concept, even though it came from the Enlightenment? How does it compete in importance?
Well, the last thing I want to say is it's the only form of identity that we have. I mean, individuals are really complex, and every one of us has some form of a gendered identity, or we have a regional identity. We could have a religious identity, and sometimes an irreligious identity. We have all forms of identities, but I think that in terms of the politics of the last 200 years, I think that the nation state, which is the most prominent form of political organization, which is sort of inscribed in the whole idea of the United Nations, which is something like 200 odd nation states, where if you look at a map in the early 16th century, people wouldn't have known what you were talking about.
Yeah.
In terms of that, I think that we can say that people have spent more energy, especially in war, in the military, in conflicts, in political conflicts that have to do with the nation and what the nation represents, and self-determination and defending one's nation. And therefore, I think that nationalism is very often, I think, if not always, very, very prominent among the forms of identity that's absolutely central.
That makes sense. I mean, I'm thinking of all the most recent conflicts, and it does seem to have some hint of nationalism. World War II, got Nazi Germany. Right now, Russia, Ukraine, like we said, Israel, Palestine, Ireland, our revolution, our civil war, go down the list. And so how could we leave everyone with a little bit of hope, where there's conflict, there's violence, we're competing, we're just trying to win and defeat the other. I talk about it in my book, but from a historical perspective, where's the hope for peace? Is it just dialogue? What is it?
Well, I think that, looking at Northern Ireland, I talked about there has to be the right historical moment, which is not necessarily, a date, but something that leads up to it. And there can be a lot of missteps. And taking the missteps can be important. In the case of Ireland, there were multiple missteps dating back to the 1970s there were attempts to resolve differences that were basically scuttled or broken apart by the extremes. So persistence is one of them.
Okay. Never give up on trying to come to some form of cooperation.
And I think that invariably, it's not going to come from the extremes. It's going to come from people more in the middle who are going to prevail upon the extremes to enter as part of a dialogue. And it involves strong leadership. You need people of vision and energy who can reach out and have the faith of large numbers of people to take them into areas of human experience which they didn't necessarily grow up with, and in which they weren't educated into, and in which they have to be sold as to why it is that we're going to make the compromises that always are going to exist in conflicts of this type.
And so it's a form of discovery, leadership, but even maybe the people who are on the extremes, it's a little harder for them. That's why focusing on the leadership is so important. If we can get leadership to want to discover and have that, I don't want to say trickle down effect because of connotation, but to get the leaders to inspire the extremes to discover, to either make friends or read or something.
Absolutely, and leadership is very precarious because there's such a fine line between people seeing you as leading them somewhere and selling you out.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, leadership is very, very difficult, and leaders aren't a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
And it's a very difficult proposition. But at certain moments, it seems that if the situation is ripe, and there's people there who have the imagination and the willingness to talk to the presumed enemy, then there can be a discussion.
And with your word of imagination, it makes me think of you have to not be so emotional to where we're not completely rationalistic, right? And we're just an economic being that thinks all rationally. We're not. But we can't be, we're going to be emotional, but being able to have some skill to help calm ourselves, to be able to take perspective, to not be so aggressive, to allow our frontal lobe to do its thing.
Absolutely, and for people to buy into the idea that it's not just about the deaths and the violence, but it's about a different future. It's about people being able to fulfill themselves in ways that these conflicts, which are self-perpetuating, never allow.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, peace for the sake of peace is faulty, right? That's the old Chinese idea. I'm not getting it verbatim. So in the same way, people want to end the conflict just to end the conflict and the bloodshed. It's not going to work.
Absolutely.
We need to have it as we want to proactively be inclusive, not in any kind of super washed idea of inclusivity that we might hear in politics, but just, being inclusive. I guess that's the best word for it.
Absolutely.
Well, anything else?
No, but again, I want to thank you for inviting me, and I just want to say that in these conflicts, which are so important, that people really open themselves up to understanding how they came about in a wider way.
What's going on, guys? Thanks for checking out my channel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and make sure to turn on notifications so you can see when I post again. See you next time.